My name is Kate Topping, and I'm the Marketing and Engagement Manager for Reload Greece. And the next session to inspire and inform us is regulation catching up with technology. To debate this session, we're very lucky to have a seasoned entrepreneur now plying his trade at Uber. Founded as recently as 2009, with operations in 785 metropolitan areas worldwide and revenues of $37 billion in 2017, which is up a staggering 85% year on year. And also on the stage, we have a partner from Freshfields, one of the world's leading law firms with over 275 years of experience in dealing with the challenges facing the world's biggest, smallest, oldest and newest businesses. And Freshfields, we're also proud to announce, is a long-standing law firm partner of Reload Greece and RG Connect in particular. Manolis, Manassakis is the head of marketplace of Europe, Middle East and Africa at Uber, responsible for their operations in one of the company's 3 mega regions. Manolis has an MBA and Certificate of Public Management from Stanford, a Master of Laws from LSE, and a Bachelor of Law from the University of Athens, plus significant experience working in entrepreneurial and venture capitalist environments. His passion for technology and the law is demonstrated by him co-founding LawSpot, a company committed to providing openness and transparency to the law. Its online hub is trusted by 250,000 monthly users and is Greece's #1 open online hub for all things legal. On the stage with Manolis is Caroline Stroud, partner at Freshfields law firm. Caroline is a commercial litigator and head of their people and reward practice. Caroline specialises in employment litigations and investigations and advises clients who find themselves the subject of investigations by regulators. Today, they will be discussing how much is too much regulation when it comes to enabling entrepreneurship to flourish. Technology is changing faster than regulators can keep up with, so this will be a very interesting discussion. Please welcome Manolis and Caroline.
So thank you very much, and thank you for coming to our fireside chat, because I'm going to interview Manolis, and I hope that you will take away some really interesting insights from his very valuable experience. When you're thinking about regulation and catching up with technology, there are so many areas where regulation can impact on starting up a business or bringing a new product to a market or going into a new geographical area. You have all the areas of licensing, you have all your employment laws, you have data protection, you have corporate governance, tax, funding. And so it is incredibly important that a regime enables the ability of people to start up a business. And Manolis has experience in the US, which is one of the areas we think of as very generous to entrepreneurship. He also is now the head of the EMEA marketplace for Uber, so has experience across Europe of regulation. And then, of course, he has very relevant experience when he was in Greece as the general manager of Uber and also in setting up his law platform. So what I want to start with is the US, and I want to ask Manolis, having been part of a healthcare startup in San Francisco, what were the things that enabled that startup in the US to succeed? And were there any lessons that could be taken to businesses in the rest of the world, including Greece?
Sure. First of all, thanks very much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. And it's really a super interesting topic. One could go on for hours, so I'll try to be brief. And then I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have with pleasure. So I'll generalize a bit of your question, Caroline. I think that generally, the 3 things, if I could sum up, which I've seen in the US, which enable entrepreneurship in general, would be, one is that one is a mindset-related element, which is the lack of fear of failure. Actually, if you do a startup and you fail, you're more employable than otherwise. This is often told as a concept. I also couldn't grasp it before being there, but I've seen a lot of friends and classmates who are actually validating this theory, so to speak. So I think the lack of fear of failure is a huge driver, because it means that people have nothing to lose by trying, which is usually the biggest blocker, at least psychologically, in venturing into entrepreneurship. The second is that, and it touches upon our conversation, is that regulation is truly, I'd use the word, accommodating to new ventures, as opposed to restraining. For example, if you look at the scooters new ecosystem in Los Angeles, first there was the companies, and then regulation had a choice. Okay, what do I do now? And the choice was, reactively, I will accommodate all interests, I will accommodate the creation of a new nascent sector, and I'll produce a piece of regulation which makes sense, which is the license requirements for the city of LA, and now all the scooter players are getting licensed as we speak. So I think that's a good example of how regulation can accommodate versus sometimes blocking. And then the other thing that I would say is that there is already a hugely mature ecosystem around all the facets you need to succeed entrepreneurially, right? What do you need? You need talent, you need funding, you need the mindset which, as I said before, exists, you need the right education, which is very practical. So for example, on the education point, it was very apparent to me, I studied both in the US and the UK. The UK felt a bit backward looking. So what have we found to be true? The US logic was, what can we do about things which don't yet exist, even legally speaking, right? How do we regulate blockchain? In the UK, the equivalent would be, you know, what's the optimal corporate governance for, I don't know, listed companies, right? I remember being taught that. So I think you have all the facets which are required, and harmoniously enable a lot of folks who already don't have a fear of failure to be able to actually execute on it.
But how do you imbibe that sort of lack of fear of failure? What can you do to make that part of the culture?
That's a very good question. I'll be very honest, a big part is deeply cultural and has also to do with family values. For example, in my case, I remember my parents being very risk-averse. Every time I would do something increasingly entrepreneurial, they would be reluctant. Their dream for me would be, okay, become an academic, you're a law professor, something like that. Whereas that equivalent parent of my classmates at my MBA, for example, would be like, hey, try whatever you think excites you. It's okay if you fail 3 times, the 4th time you're going to make it work, etc. So I think that a big part is really start early, and it has to do with family. Same with school. It's a very risk-averse and a culture which focuses on existing subject matter expertise, whereas I remember there was a definition of entrepreneurship which I like, which is the pursuit of doing business with resources not currently at your disposal. So it's a forward-looking, risk-taking thing. If you don't have that mindset and you rely on what you already have and own, by definition, you cannot pursue that kind of entrepreneurship. So at least for me, that was the biggest blocker. Because, I mean, the funds and the people and the expertise you can find, and that's actually the easy part, to be honest. The harder part, at least for me personally, was the psychological, kind of the daring part. So that's my view on it.
The second thing you mentioned was the ability of bringing in a regulation quickly. So you referred to the scooter licensing and regulation regime. If we were to move to Europe, which is, of course, where you're responsible now, I imagine there might be more bureaucracy generally.
You're not incorrect. Yeah.
So looking at your job now, and you're head of marketplace for Uber, you must have experience of very different regulatory approaches from the different countries, even though you've got the overlay of the European Union. And I thought you might just tell us some stories about some countries which have done some really interesting things to encourage, for example, platforms being established for, startups to being able to be quick and nimble in the way that they can pull funding and licensing together.
Sure. First of all, I think it's really, it's a political issue, right? For example, to talk about Greece a bit, there is nothing really missing, right? There is talent, for sure. We are a very nice location to be in. I can see no reason why a company wouldn't like to do its, its hub for southeastern business in Greece. And maybe even in areas where there is sectoral relevance, like tourism and shipping, you could have your actual global headquarters in Athens, etc. So if you were to map what is needed to do that, you would find it available or potentially available in Greece. So it's a political issue, political in the broad sense. That doesn't mean it's easy. I would argue it's actually more complicated because of the nuances and the complexities that we all know. So, so Greece, I don't think is a good example for that. As good examples, I would mention Estonia. Estonia is a fantastic example of, a small country. Its economy didn't have, at least in my understanding, something distinctively unique or amazing. But they're doing all the simple stuff great, and now they're becoming a huge investment hub, a hub for progressive regulation, a hub for entrepreneurship, etc. If you look at, for example, in my space, their ride-sharing regulation, the most modern in Europe, I think. You pay your taxes automatically. You just say, I agree, that the work is done, I think, online by the state itself. You can create a company, I think, in minutes. So these are things which it's not hard. I mean, as a thought experiment, if I asked each one of you to spend 2 hours and write down a system which could achieve this, you could. The problem is, okay, the political will. Who's going to be made more uncomfortable by that? What's the cost of inertia? Changing government consistently, regularly, which means that an initiative starts in January, there's a new, the people landscape is completely new in November after a government reshuffle, so that work is interrupted. So things like that are a problem. And then I'll also mention a country close to us, Croatia, who again, in the transportation sector I'm more familiar with, realized that regulation is not necessarily a zero-sum game, which I think is a false perception a lot of people have. So there are two interest groups. Let's say in transportation there is taxi drivers and private hire vehicles, okay, which is Uber's model in many countries. One thought would be, okay, if I'm going to favor somebody, I'm going to disfavor the other party. That's not necessarily the case. So in Croatia, for example, they merge these two categories into one system with the same rules, and there's no longer this distinction and friction between groups with supposedly contradictory interests. So I think that's a very good example of bridging supposedly contradictory and zero-sum game interests into actually something which is net effect positive for all parties involved.
And do you think that the European Commission or the European Union has got a role to play in assisting countries with their entrepreneurship, with their looking to the future? Or is it just an old institution? I can say that because I'm British and we're
sure.
coming out of it. But is it an old institution tied up with its rules, not looking ahead, and is going to be a barrier?
Sure. Conceptually, there are two ways that the EU can be relevant, very simply thought. One is to remove blockers, so it's the lifting of negative elements, and the other is to enable actually positive change. Of course, extremely well-funded, extremely well-peopled, the right agenda. You see initiatives around blockchain, you see initiatives around data protection, initiatives around investment, equity fund, etc. So I think that, again, all the right elements are there. Again, as is the case with Greece, I would say that when there is a blocker, that blocker is usually the politics and the alignment. So this EU-wide policy, does it work for Malta and the Germany at the same time? Does it work for Croatia and Portugal at the same time? Because the people who are managing all that, are they also tied to parties and interests? And the answer is, unfortunately, I think, I'm not an expert on the subject at all, but as a citizen of Europe, I think the answer is yes. So I think that this is actually what's blocking us many times. Because again, to mention Estonia, we've seen practically that when you have that alignment, I don't think there is some fierce opposition in Estonia saying we shouldn't try to become an investment hub, have our taxes paid online extremely quickly, help create a company within minutes. I don't think there's that voice in Estonia. And you can see that the results are quite extremely impressive. At least for me, as a reader of what Estonia is doing, I'm extremely impressed.
And I suppose Uber as an organisation has actually suffered over past years quite considerably from regulation biting onto the business. Were there things perhaps that if you'd had the advantage of sort of seeing into the future or looking into the future that you think Uber as a business might have done because it actually expanded so fast and in part was not necessarily sort of complying with the regulatory framework. Now, of course, you wish to do so because you're probably going to go into a public sort of business. And so if you were standing here now and you were talking to all these people, which you are, thinking into the future, what could be done differently in the way a company expands really quickly?
Sure. Two things, but let me first clarify this point, if I may. I think there is a perception that tech companies, and then increasingly so innovative companies which like to think they're innovative, they're against regulation. No, regulation is absolutely needed. The question is, what kind of regulation is it going to be? Nobody likes operating in a hazy, gray, non-regulated area, because remember that companies themselves need protection through regulation, right? So they're not only the victims of the regulation, they're actually also the beneficiaries of it. So regulation is absolutely needed and desirable by all companies in the world, including tech companies, including innovative tech companies. And I think that message has not been relayed clearly by people like me. So to really answer your question, I think there are two things which we could have done better in the past. One is that we didn't do a great job on reinforcing that idea of the absence of the zero-sum dynamic. We allowed or even fueled the debate of Uber or trains or taxis or flying cars, etc. So this came across as indeed a zero-sum dynamic where there is no, where it's a Pareto optimality situation. You cannot favor somebody without disfavoring somebody else. Whereas in fact, I think that there is you can favor everybody at the same time. And I'll give a simple mathematical example. There's a taxi driver and a customer. You would think that if you, increasing the price or decreasing the price either favors the one side or the other side of it, right? The answer is no. If by technology, if by efficiency, if by helping that taxi driver position their car in the right time and the right place, you can help them, instead of doing one trip, doing 1.7 trips per hour, and then they reduce their price from 10 euros to 8 euros, what happens is that both the customer pays less and the driver makes more money. Who absorbs that loss, that the price reduction really? Efficiency, technology, improvement of the process. So this is a simple example to highlight that it's really not a zero-sum game. You can benefit all the parties involved at the same time. So that's one I think we could have done better. And the second, I think, also a bit because of our very Silicon Valley DNA, which is fantastic on a lot of stuff. It's a high beta thing to have, right? When it's good, it's fantastic. But you know, in places like Europe, things work a bit differently. It's not Silicon Valley, also with the political and social and historical context. So I think that maybe the company was too fierce, or try to export the American mindset without making sure that this is actually something which makes sense in other countries. But I'm extremely pleased to see that I think Uber has, and the whole sector, by the way, we're just talking about Uber coincidentally, but it's a whole ride-sharing sector. So the sector has really changed, excuse me, attitude, and is much more conciliatory. Really, everybody in the sector wants to partner with all the authorities, and really want to make sure that we end up in that, the equivalent of that numerical example I gave, where everybody is actually better off through high tech.
And I think you've talked, and Uber talks about sort of modern mobility, which is effectively how we all get around. It's not just by cars, it's by all sorts of things like the scooters and the bikes. And Uber also has Uber Eats and brings food to your door, and is going to have driverless cars and everything else. How do you think that regulation could help with the collaboration that's going to require with other businesses? So you, as an organisation, will need to collaborate with, you know, the restaurants on the Uber Eats and the bike providers, etc.
Sure. I think this is a case where actually the path to progress is an organic one, and the incentives of the players are already in place. So regulation just needs to be the referee, not to be a player in that playing field. For example, Uber already is partnering with, for example, the SNCF in France, with Barcelona Football Club, with restaurants through the Uber Eats platform, with car manufacturers to build the car of the future, with even real estate companies to help get the properties where on top you can build helipods where you can have flying taxis, right? So this is already dictated by the business and the sector itself to partner with all other entities. So there I think regulation can do two things. One is to allow and enable that, so do not block it. And the second is that, again, to my point that nobody wants no regulation. Regulation here should really be present and try to achieve all the public policy considerations. Competition, I mean, very relevant to you, right? Safety, fairness, right? For example, if you let in the airline industry, if you didn't mandate that as a regulator, I want every 1,000 hours to have a maintenance check, some CEO could do a bit of cost cutting, take a tiny bit of risk more, and say I'm going to do it every year, not every 3 months. That's where you need regulation when you have public policy considerations, in this case safety, to inject the mandate to do something when the organic motivation in terms of business is not there. But if it is there, you just simply need to watch and do not block it. So that's my view on the role of regulation there.
I mean, one of the areas that regulation really does impact on, and particularly for new businesses, is regulation around employment laws and how much pension you have to pay for people and benefits and how much security they have in their roles. And obviously, startups are very fluid, don't want to take on those obligations. Perhaps people want to work in a number of startups, and we call it the gig economy. And Uber itself obviously struggles with some of these concepts with the status of the drivers in the different countries, etc. Are you a supporter of very sort of non-protection type employment laws for startups?
No. So conceptually, let's see where we want to go and then reverse engineer what's the path there from a regulatory perspective, right? So, and I don't have the answer. I'm just saying, okay, what's the future of work? What do people want? For example, flexibility is one. At the same time, healthcare coverage is another, right? Which, again, seems to be contradictory, but it's not. There is a way. I think we've looked at things a bit monolithically or in a bit of a sharp contrast. It's either you're an employee or absolutely no protection, gig economy contractor. I think there are some jurisdictions. I think France, for example, has the status of independent worker, which is something in between. I don't know the nuances, but I think that's the case. So my point is that, again, there is a middle ground. And as soon as we realize in terms of a public policy agenda, but not, sitting in a vacuum and, dreaming of policies, talk to 10,000 people working on that sector and really understand, okay, what do they love, what should be improved, talk to the companies, talk to the stakeholders and talk to the employees, and then we'll come up with a set of objectives you need to go towards, and then regulation can accommodate. And I would guess that, again, there is a way to accommodate optimally all these considerations. So surely the answer is not no regulation. The answer is accommodating and forward-looking regulation. And by accommodating, I don't mean just for the businesses, I mean for all stakeholders. That includes every single entity or person which is somehow involved in this ecosystem.
So I think we're nearly out of time, but just final question.
Sure.
What are the 2 key learnings that you would like to give to Greek government, Greek legislation, in respect of how to really support an entrepreneurial ecosystem in Greece?
Sure. Let me narrow down to what's feasible and not dreamy. One is consistency. What really kills entrepreneurs is constant and unpredictable change for the worse, and that's often referred to in the context of taxation. It's okay it's not okay, but it's survivable if tax rate is 50%. But I need to know it's 50%, and it's going to be 50% for 3 years. When I do my business plan, I can price that in, that's fine. But if it's 50, and then every 3 months there's some change, and honestly, I think that's the rate of change in the last 80 years. Literally, I think it's 3 times a year there's some change somehow in the tax law. So we need consistency and stability, because businesses are not 6-month ventures. It's 5-year, 10-year, 20-year ventures, right? And when you talk about sectors which are even more long-term, like real estate, for example, exit can be in 30 years. So, and this is easy to just do not refrain from this need to always, an incoming government always dismantles what the previous government did and does something new. Then the other government which comes in takes the opposite direction. And we're just zigzagging, not even zigzagging, maybe we're just, just vacillating on the same point, like right and left, without making any real progress. Because people are really biased towards action. People want to show they do stuff. Sometimes just leave something be if it's great and work incrementally on improving it. So that's one. And then second, on a case-by-case basis, remove the obstacles, simplify the processes, creating a company, having a company funded, enable linkage of education to the workplace. This is almost viewed as an anathema in Greece. I don't know why. Companies should be away from the universities, whereas people want to graduate and they want a job. So you're not helping by creating this chasm between them. So things like that. Yeah, but there is a lot to be done for sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure, pleasure.
Thank you. So I've probably quizzed Manolis quite a bit already, but would anyone like to ask a question?
So my question is, can we afford having regulation catching up with technology? Hello. So my question is, can we afford having regulation catching up with tech? When it comes, for example, to autonomous vehicles, Uber had already an accident, and I wanted to, if you can share, what's the role of a company like Uber in helping maybe policymakers before launching a new innovation in the market?
Sure. Of course, there is a huge role to be played. I think that things are getting so complex and so intertwined that the idea of a regulator acting alone on any single field, I would say, is illusory. I cannot think of any single field where you can have the regulators in a room doing research or whatever they do and to come up with optimal regulation. And of course, increasingly so in a field which is so complicated, understood by a few people because it's very high tech, and we're actually on the path towards it, right? It's not even a set thing. So I can imagine a world where the regulator, I don't know, you can call it a conceptual round table, right, where everybody's represented. So there's the industry, there's the employees, there's the employers, there's a regulator, there is relevant advocacy groups, and there is representatives of the public policy considerations, like safety in your example. And they jointly are able to help governments produce the optimal regulation. And I think in many countries and in many cases where things are a bit very collaborative and very progressive and going in the right direction, I think, this is already the case. So I guess the answer is we need to keep doing that as opposed to one-sided regulation or even politically charged regulation or regulation which serves some partisan and in the narrow sense, political objective.
We've got time for one more question. Oh gosh, there's loads. Maybe the person right at the back on the left. You've got lots of questions.
Hello, and thank you both for the great discussion. I was wondering, in my mind, I've seen examples of good reactive regulation and bad reactive regulation. But I was wondering if you could give us some examples of good, hopefully, proactive regulation that aims to remove obstacles before they become apparent or before they're realized.
Sure. I'm not an expert at all on the things I'm going to mention, and conceptually, I have some thoughts. I don't know exactly the nuances and practically how they work, but I would think of regulation actually creating sectors and enabling sectors being created. For example, solar energy. When you can introduce regulation to say, hey, instead of having the E being in charge of electricity and having it centralized, I'm going to create a framework of crowdsourcing energy production. And this, I think, has been a thing in Greece. I don't know exactly where it stands in progress, right? But conceptually, this is an area where regulation does create a whole sector which didn't exist before. So that's an example of proactive regulation. Another piece of proactive regulation would be the idea of I don't know the actual exact term in English, but χρηματιστήρια ρήπων, or in English, I don't know, stock exchange, pollution stock exchanges where you charge people for pollution. So you have the definitional public policy problem, which is actually global pollution. What is more global and macro and important than that? And then you create regulation to, in the future, change people's and companies' behavior towards a public policy objective. So that's when regulation is the first actor in that sequence of events to bring about positive change. And I'm sure if we think more, we can find more examples, but if your implicit question is that conceptual regulation is always behind, no, regulation might as well be ahead, and actually might also be even the catalyst, not even the creator of whole new spaces. Like space, for example, let's see how regulation is going to deal with that, right? But I can imagine regulation potentially opening up, I don't know what it's going to be, but a lot of areas and industries around the idea of being able to take advantage of space, which is technologically becoming feasible gradually.
Well, thank you very much, Manolis. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Pleasure. Great question.